In the quiet town of Arkansas Hollow, where pine trees whispered secrets to the wind and every neighbor knew the sound of another's footsteps, Martha Ellery was a name spoken in both pity and confusion. She was a widow of 42, small and pale, with sharp blue eyes that never quite revealed what she was thinking. Her husband, Henry Ellery, had died 2 years ago in a sawmill accident. His funeral had been somber, the church filled with candlelight and whispers. But what people remembered most, what they could never forget, was Martha's laughter. Not a nervous giggle, not a sob mistaken for a chuckle, but a full, echoing laugh that rose during the preacher's final prayer. From that day forward, people began calling her the Laughing Widow. Some said she had lost her mind from grief. Others said she had no heart. Children whispered about her as if she were a ghost in daylight. Yet Martha went about her days, tending her small garden, baking bread, mending clothes, never defending herself, never explaining why. But behind that laughter lay something far deeper than madness. By 1894, the Hollow was a place where gossip traveled faster than the river current. The women of the church, led by Miss Ada Pike, made it their mission to save Martha's soul. "She mocks the Lord's sorrow," Ada would whisper, fanning herself after Sunday service. Laughter at a funeral is a sin, plain and clear. Martha heard these whispers each week when she sat at the very back pew, silent and composed. One Sunday, Reverend Samuel Griggs, a man known for his calm heart, walked her home after church. "Martha," he said gently, "I know folks talk, but truth often wears a quieter coat. You've borne much. I only hope your laughter isn't a burden you can't put down." She smiled faintly. "Oh, Reverend, it's not a burden. It's the only thing that's ever kept me standing." And though he didn't fully understand, the Reverend saw something honest in her eyes, something he'd never seen in all his years of preaching about grief. Martha's small home sat near the edge of Hollow Creek, a slow brown river lined with reeds and willows. One afternoon, she found a boy sitting there, about 12 years old, barefoot, skinny, staring into the water. His name was Tommy Carter, the blacksmith's son. His little sister had died from fever that spring. "I heard you laughed when they put your husband in the ground," Tommy said bluntly. Martha didn't scold him. Instead, she sat beside him, letting her skirt brush against the wild grass. "I did," she replied softly. "And I'll laugh again when it's my time, too." The boy frowned. "Why? Ain't that wrong?" "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes laughter is the only way to keep sorrow from eating you whole." Tommy didn't answer, but weeks later, when his mother wept herself into silence, the boy would remember Martha's words and understand them a little better. That summer, a new tragedy hit Arkansas Hollow. Grace Wilburn, the town's beloved midwife, passed suddenly during childbirth. Her funeral drew the whole town, and so did Martha. People turned to watch as she entered, her black shawl draped like a shadow. "Don't let her sit near the front," Ada Pike whispered. "She'll spoil the mourning." But Martha sat anyway, near the casket, where she could see Grace's peaceful face. As the preacher spoke, the silence grew heavy. When he said, "Grace has gone to her eternal rest," a soft sound broke from Martha, a laugh, low and trembling, but unmistakable. Gasps filled the room. Ada Pike rose in indignation, whispering, "Blasphemy!" Yet Martha simply bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. No one saw the tears streaming down her face. That night, as thunder rolled over the hollow, Reverend Griggs knocked on Martha's door. She opened it with a candle in hand, her eyes rimmed red. "I don't want to talk about it," she said before he could speak. "But you must," he urged gently. "They think you mock the dead. If you don't explain, they'll turn crueler." Martha looked out at the rain. Let them. They can't understand what it means to lose everything and still find laughter waiting. Tell me then, he said. Help me understand. She hesitated. Then her voice softened. When Henry died, I wept until I couldn't breathe. I begged God to take me too. But then, at the funeral, when they lowered him down, I remembered how he tripped on our wedding day, how he laughed even with a broken nose. I heard that laugh in my mind, and I realized he wouldn't want me to die crying, so I laughed for him. The Reverend stood silent. For the first time, he saw her not as a woman who mocked death, but as one who refused to let death mock her. Word of Martha's confession spread like wildfire. Some townsfolk softened, others grew harsher. Ada Pike called for a church vote to bar the laughing widow from communion. She disrespects the sanctity of grief, Ada proclaimed. But not everyone agreed. Tommy Carter stood up in the crowd and said, "My pa cries every night since my sister died. Maybe if he could laugh like Miss Ellery, he'd remember her better." The boy's trembling voice silenced the hall. Reverend Griggs quietly canceled the vote. Martha, standing at the doorway, said nothing. But that night, she placed fresh flowers at Henry's grave and whispered, "See, love." The world's still learning autumn came, bringing with it a traveling peddler, a young man with clever eyes who sold trinkets, lace, and old books. His name was Elias Boone, and he had a storyteller's charm that drew crowds. He stopped at Martha's gate one afternoon and asked for water. "You're the widow folks whisper about, ain't you?" he asked, smiling kindly. "I suppose I am," Martha said. "Funny thing," Elias mused. "In some countries, laughter at a funeral is a blessing. Means the soul's gone in peace, and the living are strong enough to smile." She blinked. "You've heard that?" "Traveled enough to know grief wears different clothes wherever you go," he said, tipping his hat. For the first time in years, Martha's heart stirred with something new. Not sorrow, not laughter, but hope. One cold November night, a barn caught fire on the outskirts of town. The Carter families. Flames tore through the wood faster than anyone could react. Martha ran barefoot through the dark with a bucket, Elias at her side. Together they helped form the bucket line, faces blackened by smoke. Tommy's father collapsed near the doorway, shouting, "My boy! He's still inside." Without hesitation, Martha ran in. The blaze roared, timbers falling like angry rain. She found Tommy huddled under a beam, coughing. She pulled him free, her hands burning as they escaped into the night air. When the crowd saw them emerge, cheers rose. And for the first time, Martha's laughter filled the night like music, ringing pure and alive. No one whispered that night. They only wept. Martha's hands healed slowly. The town sent her food, quilts, and thank you letters. Even Ada Pike brought her a jar of honey, though she still muttered about improper laughter. Elias visited often, fixing her fence, reading her stories from faraway lands. The hollow began to change. People greeted her with smiles instead of stares. At Christmas, the Reverend asked her to speak at church. She stood before the congregation, trembling slightly, then said, "Grief doesn't end. It changes. We laugh not because we forget, but because we remember too well. Every laugh is a thank you to the ones we loved for teaching us how to live." For the first time, no one questioned her. When she left the church, snow began to fall, and she swore she felt Henry's hand brush hers in the wind. Months passed. Elias Boone prepared to leave town, his wagon loaded for another journey. Before he left, he handed Martha a folded piece of paper. "It's from a place called New Orleans Gazette," he said. "I wrote about you, about the widow who laughed during funerals. They want to print it." She blinked in disbelief. Why would anyone care for such a story? Because it's not about death, he said softly. It's about what comes after. She unfolded the letter later that night. It spoke of courage, of finding light in loss, of a woman who defied sorrow with laughter. And at the bottom, Elias had written, "Sometimes the truest joy is born in the darkest place." Martha pressed the paper to her heart. For the first time, her laughter came not from pain, but from peace. By spring of 1895, the small town of Arkansas Hollow found its name in places no one ever expected. Newspapers from Little Rock to New Orleans carried the story of the widow who laughed during funerals. Martha Ellery became something of a mystery legend, the woman who defied grief with a smile. Some came to visit her, curious travelers, reporters, and widows who had lost their own loves. They sat with her in the garden, beneath the pear tree Henry had planted, asking, "How did you find laughter when you lost everything?" And she always answered softly, "I didn't find it. It found me because I kept my heart open long enough to hear it." The hollow began to change with her. People stopped fearing laughter at funerals. Some even smiled when recalling the ones they'd lost. But not everyone approved. Ada Pike called it the devil's charm. Yet even Ada's heart would soon be tested in a way she never imagined. Late one summer morning, Ada's husband, Elias Pike, collapsed in the churchyard. The doctor said it was his heart, quick and merciless. The funeral was quiet. Ada sat in the front pew, stiff and pale, while the preacher spoke words she barely heard. Halfway through, she glanced toward the back. Martha was there, standing in her black shawl, eyes glistening. For a moment, Ada felt bitterness rise like bile. How dare she come? But when the choir began to sing, something strange happened. Martha's shoulders trembled, and then she let out that same familiar sound. A laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mocking. It was gentle, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And for the first time, Ada didn't feel anger. She felt release, because beneath that laughter, she heard something she hadn't let herself feel. Hope. Tears rolled down her cheeks, mingling with a smile she didn't know she still had. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Martha's door. It was from the editor of the New Orleans Gazette. "Dear Mrs. Ellery, your story has touched hearts far beyond Arkansas Hollow. We wish to publish your words in a book, Laughter and Loss, The Widow's Gift. We can offer payment for your time and rights to print your story. Yours in admiration, Edward L. Trask." Martha read the letter 3 times. She'd never imagined her quiet life could reach beyond the creek and the pines. But what moved her most wasn't the offer. It was that her laughter, once seen as madness, was now a message of healing. That night she walked to Henry's grave and placed the letter there. "Looks like your clumsy old laugh is still doing good, Henry," she whispered, "even from the other side." The wind seemed to rustle in reply. By 1896, the Hollow was no longer the same town. Where funerals had once been solemn and silent, now came hymns and gentle laughter. Stories told of the departed instead of just mourning. The Reverend said, "Grief doesn't leave us, but it teaches us to love harder." Ada Pike, now a widow herself, began helping others through loss. She even opened a small comfort circle, women gathering to talk and share memories. And at its first meeting, she asked Martha to speak. When Martha entered, every woman fell quiet. She told them, "When I laughed that first time, I thought the world would never forgive me. But now I see, laughter isn't disrespect. It's remembering joy with the same strength we remember pain." And for the first time, Ada smiled back at her. One bright morning, a familiar wagon creaked up Martha's road. Elias Boone, the peddler who'd once written her story, was back. He looked older, a little wearier, but the warmth in his eyes was the same. "Seems I owe you a thank you," he said, stepping down. "That article helped me find my voice. Folks started calling me a writer instead of a wanderer." Martha smiled. "And here, I thought you were just a charming salesman." He laughed. "Still am. But now I sell stories instead of spoons." He stayed for supper, biscuits, beans, and laughter. As the sun set, they spoke of loss, of second chances, and of how both of them had learned that sometimes the heart heals in the most unexpected ways. Before he left, he said softly, "Maybe next time, I'll stay longer." Martha didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said, "You'll be welcome." That winter brought more than snow. It brought sickness. A fever spread through Arkansas Hollow, taking the weak and old first. Reverend Griggs fell ill, as did many children. Martha, though weary, became a caretaker, tending to the sick, baking bread, sitting by their bedsides through the long nights. Elias returned when he heard of the fever. "You shouldn't be out there so much," he warned. But Martha smiled weakly. "If I can still laugh, I can still help." Days turned into weeks. She caught the fever herself. One night, delirious and sweating, she heard Henry's voice in the room, soft and familiar. "Don't be afraid, love. You've given enough." But she whispered back, "Not yet. Not while they still need me." Her laughter was faint, like the sound of wind over water, but it lingered through the night. For 3 days Martha drifted between life and death. Elias never left her side. He read aloud from her favorite book, Pilgrim's Journey, hoping she could hear him. Sometimes she smiled faintly, even in her fever dreams. She saw Henry there, standing on a hill bathed in golden light, his hand outstretched. "Not yet," she told him in her dream. "I still have work below." When she finally awoke, weak but alive, Elias was asleep in the chair beside her, holding her hand. She whispered, "Seems heaven didn't want me just yet." And though her body trembled, her laugh filled the small cabin once more, quiet, grateful, and alive. By the next spring Martha had recovered. Her book, Laughter and Loss, was published. The Gazette sent her a copy bound in soft leather, with her name in gold letters. The Hollow celebrated with a town gathering. The Reverend rang the church bell and read aloud her dedication. "For all who grieve, may you find the courage to remember love with laughter, not only with tears." People cheered. Some wept. Ada Pike hugged her, saying, "You turned sorrow into a sermon, Martha." Elias stood beside her, smiling proudly. And for the first time Martha felt something she hadn't felt since before Henry's death: belonging. A year later, Reverend Griggs passed peacefully in his sleep. The whole town gathered to say goodbye. When the preacher's son asked Martha to speak, she stepped to the front, her shawl wrapped tight. She looked at the crowd. Faces that once judged her, now softened by love. She said quietly, "He taught us faith. But more than that, he taught us how to see God in one another. Let's send him off with what he gave us most: light." Then she laughed, not loud but pure, and soon others followed. The sound filled the church, rising like a hymn. Even the preacher's son smiled through his tears. And as the bell tolled, laughter echoed across the hills, carrying the soul of Reverend Griggs home. Years later, after Martha's passing, her cottage still stood by the river, a little weathered but still bright with flowers. Travelers still came to Arkansas Hollow, asking for the story of the widow who laughed at funerals. They'd find an old wooden bench near the pear tree, where townsfolk had carved a plaque in loving memory of Martha Ellery. She laughed so others could live. Elias Boone, now an old man, often sat there, reading her words aloud to visitors. Sometimes he swore he could still hear her laughter in the wind. gentle, distant, but full of life. The townspeople began a new tradition. At every funeral, someone would share a funny story about the departed, not to mock, but to honor the joy that once lived in them. And so, in that quiet little hollow of Arkansas, laughter became a form of prayer. The woman once mocked for her laughter had left behind a lesson deeper than sorrow, that to truly honor life, we must not only mourn its end, but celebrate that it ever existed at all.